Hello, I'm Dr. DeBellis. Thank you for joining me today. I'd like to discuss evolution of the brain as it relates to behavior. But before starting, I'd like to explore the theory of evolution. In subsequent lectures, I plan to also talk about evolution in animals, and then finally evolution in hominids, which includes evolution in human beings. I'm going to start by talking about the theory of evolution. So, before Socrates, the Greek philosophers believed that organisms could actually descend from other organisms. However, as recently as 200 years ago, it was still believed that the different species were unrelated. Fossils of extinct species did provide evidence for evolution, which is the gradual change of a species, but plausible mechanisms were still lacking. In 1828, Carl Ernst von Baer wrote that embryonic development of an organism mirrors its history. And decades later, Ernst Haeckel proclaimed that ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny. This means the development of an organism recapitulates the phylogenetic or evolutionary past of that organism. Hegel was also an artist, and he drew these drawings here. And if you look, you can see that the different organisms on the left, we have a fish, next to it a salamander. We find that each of them looks like a more primitive, less developed organism in its gestational period. However, it becomes more differentiated with age. And Hegel indicated that this is kind of like reminiscent of evolution. What happened in 1859? Well, something big happened. In 1859, Charles Darwin and Alfred Wallace proposed evolution by natural selection. This was a theory that says evolution proceeds by differential success and reproduction. Now, Darwin received most credit, but Wallace shared this discovery and he went on to other projects. He had various projects that he was working on, and Darwin actually also had more financial backing as well in his family. So Darwin's who we typically associate with the theory of relativity. However, both of them simultaneously discovered this and worked together. They collaborated on an article about this. So down below, we can see Charles Darwin. He was a naturalist and a biologist. His father was a physician and a financier, and Darwin struggled in medical school and preparing to be a Parsons at Cambridge. Then in 1838, against his family's wishes, he volunteered to voyage on the HMS Beagle as a naturalist to investigate wildlife in the newly acquired lands. So his adventure was initially believed to be 2 years, but he ended up going on this adventure for 5 years. He was also prone to seasickness, so he spent a lot of time going onto the land and inventorying all the different organisms that he could find. He explored the coastal areas in South America, as well as Africa and Australia. He took copious notes as a naturalist. He collected different finches in the Galapagos Islands, and he believed that the finches were all similar to a type of mainland finch, which was their common ancestor. And when he returned, he analyzed the data with John Gould and made some really fascinating discoveries. He discovered that finches on each island were distinctive in size, beak, and claw structure. And these different features were adaptations to the different food sources on the different islands. So depending on whether you were going to be cracking open large hard nuts or smaller nuts, or whether you were going to be feeding on berries, you'd want a different type of beak. There would be a different type of beak that would be selected for or against. But the thinner beaks are better for capturing ants, while the larger ones are better for deshelling nuts. So Darwin published On the Origin of Species in 1859. This is a really shocking book because Galileo was the first person to say human beings are not at the center of the universe. Charles Darwin also shocked the world whenever he said that we are not unique from the animal kingdom. Similarities among these bone sets down here, they reflect a descent from a common ancestor, a phenomenon that we're going to call homology. Now, we now know that all life on Earth shares a last universal common ancestor that lived 3.5 to 3.8 billion years ago. And Darwin's hypothesis was that reproduction will increase a population rapidly unless factors limit it. He also believed individuals of a species are not identical, and that some variation is somehow inherited. Unfortunately, he had no idea how this occurred because genetics was not discovered yet, so there was no field of genetics, and he was stymied by this. Now, a gap in his theory was his inability to specify either the source of variation upon which natural selection acted or the mechanisms of inheritance. So, now the Austrian monk Gregor Mendel discovered the predictability of inheritance through independent assortment, and Hugo de Vries devised mutation theory later. But in 1856, so Gregor Mendel was the first geneticist, and he was working on his genetic studies of 29,000 pea plants, which would lead to his discovery of the predictability of inheritance through independent assortment. But it received little attention. There was a copy mailed to Darwin. Darwin never read it. So, and then again, Hugo de Vries came along and contributed mutation theory. Now, Gregor Mendel coined the terms dominant and recessive genes. And dominant genes don't necessarily become dominant over time. So in Darwin's hypothesis, again, some variation is inherited. And then finally, the fourth part here is not all offspring survive to reproduce. So below you can see Biston betullaria. It's the English peppered moth. The English peppered moth can have a mutation that will actually change its color. So if we look up here, we can see that a gray pepper moth ends up having a darker mutation and a lighter mutation. So according to evolution, mutations cause variation. Unfavorable variations are selected against. So if a crow sees a black moth, it's going to stick out. It's going to be higher contrast to the stones behind it. Therefore, it's more likely to become dinner for the crow. Now, something changed in 1760. The Industrial Revolution occurred in Europe, and the suet in the air actually covered the sides of the buildings. So all of a sudden, the buildings are not tan or gray or white, they're all black. As a result, being a lighter colored peppered moth is actually going to decrease your likelihood of surviving to reproduce. Therefore, unfavorable variations such as this are selected against. And when reproduction occurs, again, there's still going to be mutations. Occasionally, you're going to have a lighter peppered moth. However, it's going to be selected against. It is a less favorable mutation. And in the end, you end up with darker pepper moths. And this is what we actually found, was that at that time, the pepper moth population was much darker because the lighter colored peppered moths were being selected against. So another example of evolution is research that was conducted at the Kashoni lab at HMS and Technion, and it demonstrates how bacteria evolve resistance to antibiotics. So for this particular study, a 2x4 Petri dish was constructed, and it was divided into 9 strips. And each of these territories had a different amount of this trimethylprime, and it's an antibiotic. So if you look in the far left and right, you can see there's not any antibiotic in those areas. Where you see the ones here, this is just enough that it would kill E. coli. Now these darker gray areas, these actually have 10 times as much antibiotic. And then the areas here that are a little darker that say 100, they have 100 times effective dose of the antibiotic. And then finally in the center, that area is 1,000 times as much of the antibiotic that's actually embedded into the Petri dish. So bacteria occupied the antibiotic are quickly but stopped when it met the antibiotic. And then a mutation emerged that allowed it to tolerate the low concentration of antibiotic and occupy the new territory. So a mutation occurred that allowed the bacteria to actually tolerate the antibiotic, and it made its way over. And eventually another mutation emerged that allowed it to tolerate the low concentration of antibiotic and occupy even higher concentrations of the antibiotic. And then finally, in a short period of time, there was a new version of the bacteria there that could tolerate that center area with 1,000 times as much antibiotic. So we could say these bacteria had, in a short period of time, evolved into a strain that was 1,000 times more resistant to antibiotics. And this is one of the reasons that doctors are so sparing whenever dealing with antibiotics to treat conditions. So now I want to mention on a side note that evolution is not simply survival of the fittest. As Herbert Spencer once described, it's not just about survival. If you were twice as strong as Arnold Schwarzenegger and you outlived a redwood tree, but you don't have any offspring, you're still invisible to evolution. Once on a museum tour, somebody made a comment. They said, "My dad said he doesn't believe in evolution because there's not any proof." Is that true? I think there's a lot of proof that evolution is happening all the time. I mean, the 2 examples that I gave with the pepper moths and the bacteria are great examples. If we look at adapting viruses, which are more resistant to antibiotics, genetic similarity between species, vestigial physical features such as goose flesh, the differing sizes of animals that are being poached or overfished. I think there are a lot of examples of how evolution is occurring all around us. Now, there's been research on people who attack the theory of evolution. This was by Weingard and Diener, and they say the most common attack is the straw man fallacy. And the straw man fallacy is an attempt to discredit an idea by replacing it with an altered, incorrect version of the idea. So if you tell somebody you believe in evolution and they said, "So you think we all came from monkeys, right?" That's not what the theory of evolution is. The theory of evolution is that we have a common ancestor with primates. So, but this is a straw man fallacy, and oftentimes this is what's used when one attempts to discredit the theory of evolution. Now, Darwin also inferred that variations affect the probability they'll survive and reproduce, and that adaptations increase the likelihood of offspring. So sexual selection is that each sex has anatomical and behavioral features that favor reproductive success. So natural selection relies on two things. Do you survive long enough to reproduce? And then how many times does an individual reproduce? So natural selection relies on both of these. Now, relevant to sexual selection, we'll discuss pair bonding versus tournament species. Pair bonders are species which adhere to monogamy and shared parental investment, whereas tournament species are those in which the males compete for access to breeding with females. We're also going to talk about genotype and phenotype. So genotype is the genetic raw data. It's basically the blueprint, whereas phenotype is how it's expressed. The contemporary evolutionary psychologist Richard Dawkins, who you might have heard of or read his book, The Selfish Gene, he's a proponent of studying genes at the level of the genotype. And he said that doing this, that studying the genotype is like a recipe for some food, whereas the phenotype is how does it actually taste. Now, other researchers actually study genes at the level of phenotype. So Dawkins is of the belief that a chicken is an egg's way of making another egg. Now, convergent evolution is a term I want to define it. Convergent evolution shows similarities in behavior or structure among unrelated animals due to adaptations to similar environments, whereas homoplasy is a characteristic shared by a set of species but not present in their common ancestor. Homoplasy is due to convergent evolution. So we can see there we've got a hawk, a flying squirrel, and a bumblebee. They don't have a common ancestor. They don't share a common ancestor. However, they all do engage in some form of flying in order to survive. Now, homology is a similarity based on common ancestry, such as the forelimbs, and analogy refers to similar function through structure. Those structures look different. So this would be, for example, a human hand and elephant's trunk are analogous, even though they're much different. Now, mutations are spontaneous changes in genes. They're a rapid form of evolution, and genetics is the study of the mechanisms of inheritance. Again, it began with Mendel and de Vries. Oftentimes, researchers study the Drosophila fly whenever they're studying genetics, because the Drosophila species, they reproduce rapidly and allow accelerated study of chromosomes. Taxonomy is defined as the classification of organisms. So now a fossil record can help date an organism. We can also use DNA analysis to quantify the differences between species. And we can also use it to estimate their divergence from a common ancestor through the rate of DNA decay. So here's a budding taxonomist here. It's my son looking through some shells. And someday he will probably learn to classify them. And when he does that, he will learn, as you are right now, about the father of modern taxonomy, who is Carl Linnaeus. So in Linnaeus' system of classification, each species has two names. There's genus and species. And that's how we classify each different shell. So the genus is a group of species that resemble each other, whereas the species is a group of individuals that can interbreed and produce fertile offspring. So over on the right is a chambered nautilus. It's a beautiful seashell. There's actually mollusk that resides inside of it and swims around in the ocean. And there are these chambers for which the chambered nautilus gets its name. And these chambers are full of air. And they're actually used so that the shell can be buoyant and the mollusk can actually get around. So if we're going to use Linnaeus's system, the first level is kingdom. It's the broadest. All living creatures can be divided into the 5 basic kingdoms. There's Animalia, Plantae, Fungi, Monera, and Protista. So mollusks, which create these shells, they would be animals. The next level down, the more specific level under kingdom, would be phylum. And here for Animalia, we'd have Porifera, Cnidaria, Arthropoda, Chordata, Mollusca. Mollusca is mollusks, and again, any snails, any clams, anything of that nature, a nautilus would be a mollusk. The next subdivision is going to be class. So we have gastropods or bivalves, which are like clams. They have 2 shells. That's why it says bi. We have several cephalopoda or cephalopods are the class that the chambered nautilus would belong to. Next we have order, which would be the nautilus. And finally, the family Natildae. So as you can see, we have all different types of shells. They can be classified in different ways, whether they're bivalves or cephalopods. And then finally, genus and species. And species is similar groups capable of interbreeding. And the chambered nautilus then would be Nautilus pompilius. Now, phylogeny is the evolutionary history of a particular group of organisms, and it may be represented as a family tree. And different species show different solutions to environmental changes. Living animals, along with fossils, allow for the study of the body as well as the brain. I want to borrow from Brett Pelham some ideas about evolution that are really important. It's important to remind yourself that evolution is very slow. This project's been going on for almost 2 billion years. It's a very conservative process. The motto of evolution probably would be, if it's not broken, don't fix it. And that's one of the reasons that we share many structures with primitive lower level creatures such as lobsters. You're probably familiar from a previous lecture that I did that serotonin levels are really important in lobsters for determining what their posture is going to be, what their social dominance. Whenever serotonin levels go up, the lobster has a more erect posture, it holds out its claws further, it looks like it's larger, it looks more threatening. And whenever a lobster wins a confrontation, serotonin levels go up and it looks stronger. Now, this is similar to what we saw in vervet monkeys when we talked about Raleigh et al. Studies, where the vervet monkeys actually have this hierarchy, and we find that serotonin metabolites are highest in the more dominant vervet monkeys, and they're the lowest in the subordinate ones. And if you remove the most dominant alpha male from the tribe and you actually put it into a one-way looking glass room, an observation room, it feels like it's been ghosted, and its serotonin levels drop dramatically. In human beings, it also seems like serotonin is strongly correlated with feelings of social worth and acceptance and social dominance. So serotonin has been conserved in human beings, in primates, in lobsters. Also, evolution comes with baggage, such as the preference for sweets. We're going to talk about why children have a preference for sweets, and unfortunately, because of this baggage, why children don't like bitter foods. It also sets us with a predisposition toward phobias. Remember little Albert, it was very difficult to condition Albert to be afraid of fluffy white bunnies, but it's a lot easier to condition someone to be afraid of beetles. Also, evolution implies continuity. And finally, according to Dr. Pelham, evolution is orderly. Here's a picture from the Museum of Natural Science in New York. It's a really beautiful exhibit that shows phylogeny going through all the different groups, linking everything together. There's a picture of me there. You can see the different organisms arranged by where they're at on the phylogenetic scale. So now I have some questions for you, and these are questions that could be similar to the ones you might see on a quiz. The blank system of classification of species was devised in order to classify animals according to their evolutionary relatedness. This system assigns each kind of animal to 7 levels of classification, ranging from very general to unique. List the 7 levels that make up a species' unique classification, starting with the most general. So what system is this going to be? If you guess the Linnaean system, you're correct. It's not the Darwinian, it's not the Wallacean or the Sapolskian. Who devised the theory of evolution? Darwin, Wallace, Linnaeus, or 2 of the above? That one should be 2 of the above, and that would be Darwin as well as Alfred Wallace. Similarity of function, although structures of interest look different, what would this be? This would be analogy. Now, the evolutionary history of a particular group of organisms would it be ontogeny or phylogeny? I made up atology. I don't think it's a real word. Maybe it is. Probably should have run it through a search engine first. So the evolutionary history of a particular group of organisms is what we're going to call phylogeny. And finally, natural selection relies on what? Being physically strong, surviving long enough to reproduce, how many times an individual reproduces, or 2 of the above. I'm going to go with 2 of the above. Surviving long enough to reproduce is necessary. We're going to talk about this in further detail in upcoming lectures, but how many times one reproduces is very important for determining fitness. So I want to thank you, and the next lecture is actually going to be about evolution in animals. So I hope you enjoyed this lecture, and I look forward to seeing you at the next one.